My dear brothers and sisters, it's 10:30, the time at which I was supposed to finish. But the little contribution that I can make to the program is, instead of taking the 40 minutes that I have been allotted, take just about 30, so that we'll be able to make up by the end of the session to some extent. The topic in this overall theme of the contributions of Indian philosophers is Sri Aurobindo's integral philosophy in relation to global harmony. The first question that arises is whether Sri Aurobindo was a philosopher. In fact, he was a philosopher, but he was much more than a philosopher. He was not just a philosopher. And actually, he did not like being called a philosopher because he said that philosophers think, whereas I see. See doesn't mean what we see with the eyes, see with that inner eye. That's what a rishi is about. Rishi means, the one who sees. And what does he see? He sees the truth, the total truth, the absolute truth. And for that, the ordinary eyes are not enough. In fact, one can see them perhaps better when the eyes are closed. So that's why, Sri Krishna told Arjun that you will not be able to get a proper view of me unless I give you Divya Chakshu, sacred eyes, divine eyes. And that is the type of a person or rishi Sri Aurobindo was. And that's why he said, I see, whereas the philosophers think. But all the same, having seen what he had seen, he tried to rationalize what he had seen for the skeptics, for those who will not be convinced unless you rationalize what you have seen. So he tried to give a rational view to his experience, his personal experience of that total truth, and that he has done at many places. If this type of rationalization was not necessary, then the short 19-verse Upanishad that he has written in the Sanskrit language was enough. Jagadapi Brahma Satyam na Mithya. This Jagad is the manifestation of the divine, and therefore it is truth, it is not an illusion. Now, that was enough. But then he had to rationalize it, and that he has done the best in the Life Divine. And if for nothing else, Life Divine is worth reading just to see how to think. And most of us would probably realize that we don't even know how to think. Now, he has done that, and to some extent he, I think, also said somewhere to the effect that he was compelled to become a philosopher, probably for this very reason, to convince the skeptics because of the atmosphere prevailing at the time, and to some extent even today. But then his philosophy is based on experience, not just mental gymnastics. So the starting point was an experience, which is always much more valuable than any amount of intellectual excursions. Now, having said that, his philosophy is called integral philosophy. Integral means total, and which is the totality that is being referred to here, the totality of the person. Now, it may sound a little elementary for many of the scholars here, but I can see a lot of young people. So I'll just go over briefly over what is the totality of a person. That we are the body is obvious. We also have a mind which we can easily relate to. The mind has two aspects, feeling and thinking. But then that is not all. And the fact that that is not all can be brought out very quickly through an example. Suppose you are going somewhere in a hurry and you find that on the road there is an accident in which somebody is injured badly, and you at once feel that this person should be taken to the hospital. But then you say that it's not going to be a very pleasant experience to take this person to the hospital. It will be a lot of hassle involved. And then you also think that I'm in a great hurry. I'm not the only one. There are so many other people who can take this person to the hospital. Now, all this has gone on inside you. Now, suppose you actually decide to take the person to the hospital. In spite of the time that you spend, in spite of being in a hurry, in spite of all the hassle that you go through, you are happy. You are happy, you have joy and lasting mental peace. On the other hand, suppose you decide not to take this person to the hospital, in spite of having so many reasons. I'm in a hurry, there are so many others who can take him, and so on and so forth. In spite of all those reasons, if you do not take him to the hospital, you feel guilty. And you may get recurrent uneasiness. Even while going to bed, you may feel, oh, today morning I had an opportunity to take this person to the hospital. I don't know whether what happened, whether somebody else took him, and so on and so forth. Now, here you can see that there are three things at work. One is the emotional part of the being, that is the feeling mind, that it's not going to be a pleasant experience, it will involve a lot of hassle. The thinking mind, which tried to support it, justify it by saying that I'm not the only one, I'm in a great hurry, otherwise I would have taken, and so on and so forth. But then, where did that initial impulse come from? Let me take him to the hospital. That came from yet another part of the being, which is our divine essence, the soul. And that actually gave us the best and most authentic choice, because listening to that voice gives me joy and lasting mental peace, whereas ignoring that voice, in spite of having 100 reasons for ignoring it, gives me a sense of guilt and recurrent uneasiness. So the totality of the person is not just the body and the mind, the feeling and the thinking part of the mind both, but it also has the divine essence or the soul, which is not an inert entity. It is not there just to give us the consolation that at least some bit of me will continue to live even after I'm dead and gone. It has a greater function than that. It is our best guide in life. It is that inner light which can guide us towards the most authentic choices and eventually to the total truth. So, because it's a spark of that total truth, the soul. So, that is the totality of the person. Now, what has all this got to do with our life? What it has got to do is that we have this divine essence. To some extent, the inner light is being experienced, is guiding our body and mind. But in fact, there's a great barrier, and therefore our life is not actually organized primarily around that divine essence. It is organized more around the body and the mind, which in fact have a sort of a housekeeping agent in the form of our ego. So the ego, plus which directs these, the needs of which are being pampered by the instruments, the body and the mind, is basically what our life is organized around. But if we are more and more aware of this divine essence and are more constantly aware and can organize our life around it, then we understand that the life would be much better. And how much we are aware of, how constantly we are aware of, and to what extent can we organize our life around a certain amount of knowledge is what our consciousness is about. So consciousness is basically awareness, and the degree of our awareness and how constantly we are aware of a particular type of knowledge is what determines how we will live. In other words, the level of consciousness would be the highest if we are constantly aware of the divine essence or the soul and can organize our life around it, and it will be at the lowest if we are not at all aware of it and we are organizing our life only around the surface. Having a very opaque barrier between that divine essence and the surface instruments, that would be the lowest. But then most of us are somewhere between these two extremes. But at the same time, if we take the human race as a whole, it has a wide spectrum of consciousness. So there's a wide spectrum. We have a certain average or somewhere in the middle where we stand, where the majority stands. We have one extreme where it is much lower than that, and those are our criminals and antisocial elements. At the other extreme, the higher end, we have our sages and saints. So we have this whole spectrum. Now, in other words, the level of consciousness determines the human nature, and the average human consciousness being what it is, it determines what we call the normal human nature or the typical human nature, or this is how human beings are supposed to behave. That is the average which gives us that mental picture. Now, we'll see in a moment now what it has got to do with global harmony. Now, the global harmony should be based on human unity. Now, unity can come only from a sense of oneness, and oneness can be inspired by love, and love is based, in other words, on a sense of being one with somebody else. So oneness, leading, inspiring love is what leads to unity. And that is the really durable basis for any harmony, whether it is harmony within our being, that is, we being unified around our divine essence, or whether it is harmony between individuals who feel one with each other, or whether it is harmony between nations, because here we're talking global, probably are thinking in terms of the world as a whole, having harmony between different parts of the world. So that is the only durable basis for harmony. And if we look at it that way, and that is how Sri Aurobindo looks at these issues, Sri Aurobindo goes to the very root of the problem. And the fact that, there is a certain amount of unity or cooperation does not mean that the harmony of this type already exists. There can be other basis for an apparent, visible, or sort of appearance of unity. And since we are talking about the world as a whole, let's start with how human aggregates have been formed. Because there are two opposing tendencies within human beings, and that translates into societies and groups of people as a whole. One is to assert our individuality. I am distinct from everybody else and I have a right to assert my individuality. The other is to form aggregates, that is to form groups. Now these are two opposing tendencies, but they are both there, and that is what has been showing up since prehistoric times. To start with, what we had were only clans and tribes, and how were these organized? They were organized around people who had a similar past, who spoke the same language, who had a similar way of life, and they formed a group, and within them there was a head, because we need an organizer or a coordinator. That has always been also a need in any aggregate. So, and he was one of them, and therefore it was a harmonious, sort of a small harmonious entity, a clan or a tribe. But then how did larger units form? The larger units formed because the neighboring tribes also had their heads, and they had this egoistic sort of desire that I should have a larger kingdom or a larger sort of a group whom I am able to rule, and therefore they, if they saw a weakness in the neighbor, they invaded, and that's how each group tried to have for its clan or tribe, the aggregate that had formed, a sort of a security system or some sort of an army. But then there were weak rulers, there were strong rulers, weak armies, strong armies, and the result was that the stronger ones could invade and annex or conquer the neighboring regions, neighboring tribes and clans, and that's how larger groups formed. Now you can understand that when you start with a small clan or tribe, there's a great deal of homogeneity, because they speak the same language, they have the same culture, and so on. The more the size grows, less becomes this homogeneity, and the groups become more and more heterogeneous. And this went on till the group was large enough to have those type of differences which could be reconciled. And what is it that supported this larger groups? What supported was that they were more secure, because they were more difficult to invade, they had more strength. Secondly, economically they are more viable, they could have more of a better economy, and that is how these larger groups survived. But then the groups kept getting bigger, and eventually we had the idea of the nation state, and further we also have had a few empires in history. Now empires have been groups of what we considered a nation state. But not only the empires have come up, the empires have also fallen. No empire has sustained for very long. And why did that happen? That happened because the empires were formed primarily by military conquest, and the one who was ruling the empire, he came to start with from a certain nation within that, and maybe within that nation from a certain clan or tribe within that. That is where that ruler came from, And uh, therefore, this person had to have some social and political devices to keep the whole empire together. But then these were just devices that were being used. Even the head did not feel a sense of oneness with all the nations that he had annexed. He had greater allegiance to the nation which to start with he had, and to some extent he was also convinced that my nation was superior, and that's why I have been able to rule all the others. And since I have been superior, sometimes he gave it a sort of a benevolent look by saying that since we are superior, we have been divined by God to rule others, so that we can teach them something and improve them. And this gave a sort of a noble color to this desire that I should be able to impose my language, my culture, my way of doing things on the other nations that have been conquered. In other words, on one hand, they try to sort of keep everybody together by using all types of gimmicks, but on the other hand, there was an inherent urge to impose uniformity on the entire empire. And when it came to economic interests, they saw how the economic interests of the parent country, which had invaded all the others, could be served. So there was a great deal of insincerity that went with it, and somehow by use of a combination of force and fraud, the empire was kept together. But eventually, because uniformity could not be achieved, and the economic interests, people could see that a large number of nations which were conquered later are being actually exploited rather than their economic interests served. So because of economic exploitation of the colonies, because of an effort to impose uniformity instead of let diversity prevail, the empires eventually had enough strain to break down. So the empires collapsed. So now what is the lesson that we learned from this? The lesson that we learn is, at least, that what is it that does not work? That is a large group of countries put together to form even an empire, forget about a world government. If they have been put together as a result of a military conquest, and that the ruler has tried to impose uniformity instead of letting diversity prevail, and if the ruler has been unfair in taking care of the economic development of the region as empire as a whole, then eventually the empire will collapse. So what is it that will work? What will work is that there should be a psychological unity which has been inspired by a sense of oneness, and this is what will let diversity prevail. And what does this require? And also that within the large group, if there is a central administrator or a central coordinator, which will be required even if you have a world government, then in the eyes of that ruler or group of rulers that at the center, all the other constituent units should have the same importance. They should be treated. Now, where does that come from? That comes from the level of consciousness. Because you see, basically, we were talking about the level of consciousness. It was basically a question of two contrasting principles which are both within us, which have been planted within us, and both have a purpose. One is the principle of individuality, which translates into the ego, and the other is the principle of forming aggregates or coming together, which expresses as love. So ego and love are two opposing principles. Ego is basically a dividing principle, and love is a uniting principle. Both have been planted in us. So far, the average level of human consciousness has been primarily ego-driven. That has driven the average individual, and that is what also has driven the average ruler of a country or an empire. And because of that, division has always sort of dominated the coming together. Coming together has been a necessity, an economic necessity, an administrative necessity, a necessity for the sake of defense, but it has not been a psychological unity based on a sense of oneness. And how does this wider consciousness, higher consciousness inspire that sense of oneness? Because it goes to the root instead of looking at the superficial features of one another, like the color of the skin, the region from which that person comes, the language which that person speaks, the way the person dresses up, the religion that the person follows. Now these are all superficial features which pale into insignificance when we look at the level at which every individual is the same. And what is that level? That is the level of the soul. Because in terms of Vedanta, we are all creation is a manifestation of the divine. That is, the creator did not create the creation, the creator became the creation. And therefore, if all creation is just another form of the same creator, the essence of all creation is the same. Not only all human beings, but all animals, plants, and even what looks like dead matter, like a stone. It only looks like dead matter, because the consciousness of the creator is dwelling also in that stone. The only thing, it's very dormant, it's not expressed. And how it has been expressed is through the course of evolution. A little more expression, we have got living creatures. A little more expression, and we got creatures which had a mind. And a little more expression, we got creatures like the human being, who have such a well-developed mind that they have been able to create not only computers, land on the moon, but now also create artificial intelligence. So that has been essentially an unfolding of the consciousness of the supreme creator hidden even in a stone. It has been a gradual step-by-step unfolding. Now, the significance of this also we'll see a little later, why I'm talking about this gradual unfolding, because if the trend so far is any indication, evolution has not stopped with the creation of man. The process of evolution is still going on, and human beings are likely to give way to a creature who will manifest that hidden consciousness of the creator or the supreme or the divine consciousness even better than the present average human being does. And the fact that can happen is the evidence is available within human beings, because there have always been a select few and far between, but a select few across geographical barriers, across traditions. They have been there from time to time, who have given evidence of such a level of consciousness being possible, where love dominates the ego, where the person is able to organize all his life around that highest and deepest and widest consciousness. Those are our saints and rishis and so on. So such people have been coming up from time to time, which means that this is possible. But as a result of evolution, what can happen is that the phenomenon which has been very rare and confined to a select few could become more commonplace, and we could have much larger number of people of the same type. So that is the trend that evolution is going to have, and this again will have has a small important bearing on how we can have global harmony. So it is this shift in the level of consciousness, that is how we look at things, which can eventually make a shift from an ego-driven personality to a love-driven personality, which in other words, it is this shift which can lead from a sense of separation to a sense of oneness. And that sense of oneness will lead to a unity which will not require uniformity, which will not insist on uniformity, because the diversity will be only seen as a sort of a beautiful variation in the types of manifestation we have, but one will still be able to see within that diversity a certain oneness which is fundamental and which is based on the divine essence of the individuals. So that is where it will come from. Say, for example, suppose there is a number of apples on a tree. They are plucked, packed into a box. Now, these apples have all forgotten that they came from the same tree. Now, what could happen if the apples had egos like us? One apple would feel that I'm better than the apple next to me because I'm bigger. Another apple would feel I'm better than the apple next to me because I'm sweeter. The third one will feel I'm better than the apple next to me because I'm more red. Now, that is what the ego is about. But if instead of ego, love became the dominant principle in these apples, what they would think of first is, we are all brothers and sisters because we came from the same tree. Now that will take over. Yeah? That will take over. So that is the shift it can make. And so you can see that Sri Aurobindo goes to the root cause of why larger aggregates like the entire globe, why larger aggregates in the globe, the practical expression of which would be a world government, why that has not happened so far, and even empires which were big aggregates, although no empire covered the entire world, but they were pretty big aggregates, why they came up and they also fell. Because the way they came up was not because of the sense of oneness, but because of other factors, and why they fell was because of the way they came up and that they were not rooted in this type of psychological unity, and that is why they fell. So he goes to the root of the whole thing. The root of the fall of empires was the current average level of consciousness, and the solution also is therefore equally radical, and that is only when the level of consciousness goes up that this will be possible. Now, this solution is not just of academic interest, it has a practical value because Sri Aurobindo and the mother have also visualized that the next leap in evolution, which will shift the balance in such a way that individuals with a higher and wider consciousness who have been a rare phenomenon so far will become commonplace. That sort of a leap in evolution is now round the corner. Human mental consciousness has reached a level where now it is time for the next leap in evolution, and this leap will be just as much as was the leap from, say, stone to life and from life to mind. This next leap will be an equally big jump, and that is round the corner. Now, you may say that, so it means that the world ways in the near future is likely to move in a direction where typical human nature itself will change in such a way that there will be a sense of oneness, and that sense of oneness will translate into love, and that love will then translate into administrative units, which could be what we call a world government. Now, you may say that all this sounds logical. If evolution from stone to man has taken place, from man to Superman can also take place, and that Superman will have a greater sense of love. And just as human beings have been able to dominate this planet, although the present type of human beings will not disappear, the other types of creatures, call them Supermen, call them better human beings, call them whatever you may like, but those human beings will be sufficient in number to cross a certain threshold, to reach a certain critical mass, so that they'll be able to dominate the affairs of the world the way human beings have done so far. Now, all this sounds logical that yes, we can go in this direction. But then is it actually happening? If it is going to happen in the near future, at least some indications should be there. Now, the fact that this is actually happening could not be perhaps seen so easily 100 years ago when Sri Aurobindo and the mother talked about it, but now it is becoming more and more clear. Firstly, there are now more and more thinkers and spiritual teachers all over the world who are talking the same language, although they may not use the same terminology as Sri Aurobindo and the mother did, that the human race is changing and it's in for a bigger change. I'll not go into the details because of shortage of time, but the people like Gary Zukav, he's one of the foremost who has been talking about this, but the other David Hawkins, Nikki de Cartere, there are many others who are now talking the same language. And they are talking about it without having read Sri Aurobindo and the mother, which makes it more significant, which means somewhere in the air, which now many others are able to perceive that this type of phenomenon is round the corner. Instead of spirituality being something for individual salvation, it is becoming more and more of a collective phenomenon. Secondly, there are statistics available to show that in spite of all what seems to be wrong with the world, the access to basic things like food, healthcare, and education at a global level is much higher today than it has been in any recorded history. All over the world, the total number of people or the percentage of the population which has access to these basic things is greater than has been the case so far in recorded history. Thirdly, what has been shown is that in spite of all the conflicts that take place, the number of deaths taking place in armed conflicts has gone down over the last few decades as compared to previous history. Fourthly, earlier one of the common phenomena coming up every few centuries was a major religious conflict. In the recent past, there has been no religious conflict interfaith dialogues have been much more than religious conflicts. And now we have started moving from interfaith to another term which has come up particularly during the last 25 years, and that is interspirituality. There's a difference between interfaith dialogue and interspirituality. Interfaith is about trying to find out some sort of similarities between different religions so that you can say, हाँ सब एक हैं. And then if there are some differences found, gloss over these differences and say that, well, they don't matter, they can be reconciled easily. But interspirituality is different. You have discovered the oneness, and on the basis of that oneness, you are just talking about that oneness instead of trying to just look for similarities and then gloss over differences. So interspirituality is going one step beyond interfaith dialogues, and what will be the next thing which will become more commonplace? That will be just plain and simple spirituality. The fact that that is also happening is quite obvious, because particularly in the Western countries, if a census officer goes and asks young people which is your religion, they openly declare, I have no allegiance to any organized religion, but I have belief in a higher power. That is the fastest growing population of young people in the Western world today. And so the world is moving away from religions to spirituality, where Sri Aurobindo and the mother had predicted 100 years ago. Another thing which is showing this is that the more and more children are being born now, because ultimately who will change the world? Who will bring in this new order? The children who are being born now, who will become young and grown up. So that's what we have to see. More and more children are now being born, which everybody is now talking about. They are asking very deep existential questions at a very young age. 3 years of age, 4 years of age, 5 years of your child, asking deep existential questions. How did it all happen? Why am I here? What am I supposed to do in the world? What is the role in my role in life? The children are asking these questions as early as age 5. And these are the children whom Sri Aurobindo and Savitri has called the sun-eyed children of a marvelous dawn. You know, they have that spark in their eyes. You can see that divinity in their eyes, shining in their eyes, the sun-eyed children. And what will they do? Of a marvelous dawn. The darkness of ignorance and lower level of consciousness will give way to that brightness, that dawn of a new era. Sun-eyed children, more and more of these sun-eyed children are being born. And when they are a little more grown, they are teenagers, they have to make a career choice. There are more and more young people looking for a career which will not just give them the conventional things like money, physical comforts, prestige, name and fame, security, stability, so on. They are not looking for those things. Well, they have to make a living, that they are practical enough to understand that, but they want a career which firstly is closely aligned with their passions and interests and inclinations and temperament, in traditional terms, in keeping with their swabhava and swadharma. Not only that, they are also trying to carve a career out of something which is not only aligned with their unique talents and abilities, but also which will make a difference to the world. That's what they feel will add meaning to their life. That is what will give purpose to their life. There are more and more young people who are making that type of choices. And if to do that, they have to earn less, they are willing to make that sacrifice. They are settling down to income as low as after working for a few years in the corporate sector, they settle down for something which leads to a 75% salary cut. And they are happy because they find that now I feel that life has more meaning. When I was in the corporate sector, not only I found it was all meaningless, but every day, they may not put it that way, I had to neglect the voice of my soul. We talked about the voice of the soul giving you the best guidance. If they listen to the voice of the soul, they keep losing one job after another in the corporate sector. गलत काम करने के बगैर काम जॉब नहीं रख सकते जब तक गलत काम नहीं करेंगे. गलत काम कराता है टीम लीडर, sign the dotted line, otherwise quit. Now, they don't want to stay there. They don't want that money. They are ready to accept a 75% salary cut just to be able to do something where they can listen to the voice of their soul and make a difference to the world. The number of such young people is growing. And eventually, many of them are doing something on their own. They are setting up NGOs. The issue about which they are passionate may be different. Someone may be interested in children, some in the elderly, some in women's issues, and some in poverty, and some in corruption, and some in environmental issues. The passions could be different, But then whatever their passion is, around that they form an NGO and try to address that issue. That is how they are trying to make a difference to the world, and many young people are doing it. Now, the way I look at it is that as the number of these individual efforts, group efforts, organizational efforts of different types, as they grow, they may look like as if they're small efforts, they're making no difference. But as their number grows, they'll be like a large number of bright dots. You might remember before we had the present type of printers, we had dot matrix printers. So if you have a large number of dots very close to each other, they can form a pattern. So if we have more and more of these dots, very soon they will not appear like individual efforts. They will look as if they are forming a pattern, as if they have sort of covered the landscape, and they are making a difference. That's what we'll see. Or another analogy which sometimes I think of is, it's like a starry sky. If you look at the sky, clear sky, which we rarely get in Delhi, but I'm sure Sonipati might be getting it. So if you look at the clear sky, which has stars, we will say, well, the choice is ours. Look at the stars and say, oh, there's a lot of brightness there. Or look at the dark sky, the choice is ours. But suppose the number of stars keeps growing. Because in the sky they may be static, but here we are talking of stars which are gradually growing in number. It's a dynamic situation. Finally, the number of stars will reach such a level that you will see only brightness. You will ignore the darkness between the stars. That is what will start dominating the landscape. So that is the type of change that is happening. And therefore, what Sri Aurobindo and Mother talked about is happening, and naturally it's a major change compared to the existing world order. And if you have to dismantle the existing world order, that will also involve some chaos and some confusion. And that is why we have plenty of chaos and confusion at national levels, international level, and even at family levels. Because children want one type of a career, the parents want another type of a career for the child. Parents are thinking in conventional terms, the child is thinking in terms of a higher level of consciousness. The two can't relate. So we have conflicts at all these levels. So if the old order has to be dismantled, all this confusion, chaos, and apparent anarchy will be there. Many of the older ways of thinking will have to be discarded, but then since attitudes change with difficulty, it will take time. That's why Sri Aurobindo said that the sun-eyed children of a marvelous dawn will be the massive barrier breakers of the world. In other words, those who rebel against the existing conventions because they are too constricting, because they are too self-looking, looking at our little self, ego-centered, these criteria, as the number grows, we have more and more people who will rebel against these, reason against these. Their conscience will not allow those type of conventions to prevail. So these will be the massive barrier breakers of the world. So there's a certain type of rebels we need. Rebellion is not looked upon as a very nice word, but all the same, it is a different type of a rebellion, because we are experiencing, in a way, a major earthquake of consciousness, and therefore there will be casualties. The casualties will be many long-standing conventions and ways of thinking, and that is what will usher in a new world order. And in that order, one will not make an effort through a military conquest to build a larger empire. It will be a spontaneous. So it means that the one sense of oneness will come first, and the empire will come later. In all types of wars, why do we need them? That is the way we'll start thinking. All these things will become a thing of the past. So, in other words, in Sri Aurobindo's integral philosophy, we have an explanation for why that type of global harmony has eluded us so far, in spite of all the empires that have been made, in spite of all the great thinkers with all their good intentions talking in terms of world government, in spite of organizations like the League of Nations first and the United Nations coming up, why this true harmony, global harmony, has eluded us. Sri Aurobindo's integral philosophy explains that. Basically, the root cause is the average level of human consciousness that has dominated the affairs of the world, and also the Sri Aurobindo's integral philosophy and vision of a leap in consciousness also tells us that just because it has been so for thousands of years, it will not continue to be so. The world will change, and that type of oneness and harmony will come. In other words, we will find an expression of what Sri Aurobindo says in Savitri, almost at the end, that what is it that makes our life meaningful? So more and more of us will start making our life meaningful. How? To feel love and oneness is to live, which means to feel love, which has been inspired by a sense of oneness, is to live, means is what actually makes life meaningful and worth living. Thank you.